Okay, turning to our social psychological explanations for helping behavior, just to kind of kick us off, there are a lot of reasons to think that just very subtle things in our environments are very influential in how we might help people. So, if you are given free things like cookies, or if when this was a thing, finding change in a public phone, or perhaps finding a coin on the ground, or having success somehow, or just seeing nice weather on a particular day, or smelling something nice, all of these different things, we might not like to think that they're going to influence our behavior in a particularly impactful way, but all of these things in different studies have predicted higher likelihood of helping behavior. So these sort of small things add up to predict our willingness to help other people. And other things that are more integrated into our lives, and pervasive, continuing sorts of stimuli, like the place that we live, also tends to be predictive in a slightly more complicated way. So a researcher named Amato was looking into something called the urban overload hypothesis. Basically, we'll get to that in a minute. But he wanted to see, what are these differences in helping between urban and rural settings? It seems like people in rural settings are more likely to help people. So he randomly selected these different communities in Australia and performed these really interesting field studies where, they had different outcomes they were studying out in the real world, either approaching people to make a purchase that the proceeds would go to a charity, a kind of silly request to just write down their favorite color when asked, somebody asking them about the wrong directions and seeing if people would correct them. They had one where they had two people walking along in front and behind a participant. Someone would drop an envelope, and the person dragging behind would see if the participant picked up the envelope, or to help somebody in a seemingly serious sort of scenario, having a bloody leg. And the likelihood of all these different behaviors was negatively correlated with population size in these Australian communities. So the bigger area you lived in, or more populated area you lived in here, seemed to suggest you would be less likely to help. So this is what I referred to a moment ago, the urban overload hypothesis. This idea that there's just too much stimulation going on in urban environments. I've talked before about how we are cognitive misers. We like to save our mental resources. And there's an idea that living in cities maybe just taxes us too much and doesn't leave us enough bandwidth to help other people. So if you live in a city currently, this idea suggests that you would be less likely to help. However, a researcher named Nancy Stiblai, who's actually at Augsburg here in the Twin Cities, she did a meta-analysis of a lot of these studies in the late 80s that were suggesting this, and she found that it's actually more complicated than that. That actually there seems to be two different relationships going on. In smaller level cities, like from little towns all the way up to places around the size of St. Paul, as you get higher and higher in population, there actually tends to be an increase in helping behavior. So population up to a certain point is positively correlated with helping behaviors. But then there is kind of a drop off when you get to bigger cities. So there is a stark difference, but a lot of people maybe were not looking at the data carefully enough and just seeing a general overall negative trend without looking at the smaller areas more individually. So it's more complicated than the urban overload hypothesis would have us think, that to a certain point, population size seems to encourage helping behaviors, and then it drops off after you hit about a quarter or half a million people. That seems to be less likely. Another type of situational influence that has been studied in the last couple decades has been responding to a like large scale threat, like to your country or well-being. And this idea that there's some kind of threat to the well-being of your country or your livelihood, it threatens our ideas that the world is just. We all tend to like that idea that the world is fair and just, and we tend to avoid ideas about our own mortality as well. So sometimes these things remind us of those, and we might compensate for those threatened beliefs or the fear of death by turning to ways that we can help other people. So people might volunteer in a sense to restore balance to the world. So what Penner wanted to do was see if the terror attacks on September 11th, 2001 had led to an increase in volunteerism in the United States. And he used this cool website that I believe is still around called Volunteer Match. You can just look for opportunities around you, and it records anonymous data that he was able to use for this. So he wanted to look in the 2 years prior to 9/11. He found there were fluctuations, but around 4,000 or so people on average were using Volunteer Match to connect with organizations. But after 9/11, this figure skyrocketed, and it was about 13,000 people a week were using this website. And again, it's just one website, but it's still a very large effect. It did return to normal levels. People didn't, maintain this forever, but they were at least slightly elevated for a while. Excuse me. So it's also interesting to think about who people were doing the volunteering for. So unsurprisingly, there was the biggest jump in crisis-related activities, like people wanting to help directly with victims and damage with the attacks. And people also wanted to engage with popular targets in their communities. There was a smaller but still measurable increase for unpopular targets. You can imagine in the wake of 9/11, there was a lot of anti-Islamic rhetoric going around. So this was, likely what they're referring to here, that people were more likely, but still not nearly as likely as for more popular targets to help Islamic related charities and things like that. So it's kind of depressing in one sense that we segment our willingness to help in this way, but it's also, kind of positive. There's still some kind of increase in willingness to help those groups after this big type of event. Okay. One important thing that you really can't get around talking about when you're talking about helping behavior and social psychology is something I mentioned in some of the first lectures, the murder of Kitty Genovese in New York in the 1960s. So she was a woman living in New York City, and she reportedly was outside of her residence when she was stabbed, raped, and murdered. Repeatedly, her attacker left and came back, possibly being scared of people seeing him, calling the police. But she did die, and there was kind of an uproar, like a delayed uproar, from an article that claimed that 38 people had witnessed this and nobody called the police. This is not how the story actually happened. Some people did actually call the police, and it leaves out the important detail that most of the people in this building, or many of the people in this building, were gay. Kitty herself was gay, and at the time in New York City, it was a crime to be gay and engage in sexual behavior with people of the same sex. So people in this building maybe wanted to call the police, but didn't feel like they could because they were a persecuted class of people, or more a persecuted class of people then than they are now. So it's important to think about those situational constraints too. But whatever the truth of this scenario, it's also true that our understanding of this event, even though it may have been less accurate years ago, led to a swell of research on why people might not help each other. One sort of thing that Bibb Latané and John Darley, some researchers that were in this area, maybe the foremost people that studied this at the time, started to notice was this idea of diffusion of responsibility. So their explanation for this kind of erroneous understanding of what happened was there were lots of people around, and people tend to feel less personal responsibility for something when there are lots of people in a particular area. This is compounded by an idea called pluralistic ignorance, that if you look around and a situation is ambiguous, you don't quite know what to do. If no one else is responding as though it's an emergency, excuse me, then you have no reason to think that something is an emergency. So there's just this kind of false sense of security that builds up through everybody looking around and deciding like, oh, things seem fine. That was probably just a playful scream that we heard. So we'll talk about this kind of stuff more when we get to conformity, how we look to other people when we don't know what's going on. But important things from this: the bystander effect is this idea that people are, not going to help in an emergency even if they're around, because if there are lots of people, they'll be likely to ignore what's going on and think that it's not their responsibility. And when situations are ambiguous, it's hard to define them as emergencies, basically. When we get to this point, it's important to distinguish between a couple types of helping we've already been talking about. So short-term versus long-term helping. Most of the research in short-term helping happens to be in emergency situations like Latane and Darley studied, and we'll move in a moment to talk about long-term helping, which we would generally call volunteerism. But Latane and Darley, like I've mentioned, they did tons and tons of stuff to study how we might decide at a moment's notice to help in an emergency. And they came up with these five conditions that we need to go through. It's a decision tree, really, that if you don't do any of these things, then you're not going to help. And generally, I would go through these five stages in a little bit more detail. But again, since we're combining lectures, I'm going to not elaborate quite as much as I usually would. But I think it's still useful to kind of look through this and think like, oh, well, how could I, why wouldn't I help, right? But there are lots of things you have to do cognitively to decide you want to help. First of all, you have to notice an event. If you're in a hurry, then maybe you're not even going to see that somebody is hurt on the sidewalk as you're walking past. There's a study about that with seminary students, that they manipulated how much of a hurry these students were in. And if they were in more of a hurry, then they were much less likely to stop and help a person on the street or the sidewalk because they didn't even notice the person. So you have to notice there's an event to actually help. You also have to interpret that event as an emergency. This is this idea of pluralistic ignorance, that if something's ambiguous, you hear a scream, you don't know if it's a bad scream or a playful scream, right? It might be someone in trouble, or it might be somebody messing around. And if you stop and listen and no one seems to be upset, or no one else is like rushing to help, well, it must be okay, right? So if you don't define something as an emergency, you're not going to treat it as an emergency. If you notice it and interpret it as an emergency, you need to assume responsibility. And this is, again, where that diffusion of responsibility comes in. This can be impactful in things as benign as like tipping at a restaurant. If there are more people at a table at a restaurant, then the proportion of the bill that people will tip goes down, because you feel like it reflects less on you if it's like a group of 10 as it would than if you're by yourself, right? You don't feel as responsible, you don't feel as implicated in that collective action. So the more people around, the less likely any one individual person is going to help. The last two, knowing an appropriate form of assistance. I mean, imagine you see someone choking. Do you know the Heimlich maneuver? Or imagine you see someone unconscious. Do you know CPR, and do you know when and how to use it? If you do, then you're going to be able to help when you see a relevant emergency. But if you don't, then you're not going to have those skills to do it. Finally, you have to implement the decision to actually help, which leads you to actually go on and do it, right? But that final decision might have a lot of things going into it. It might be a cost-benefit analysis. Like, is it worth saving this person? You can imagine someone drowning in a public pool. You might notice that event, interpret it as emergency, think that you can help, realize that you know how to swim and pull somebody to safety. But if it's a pool, that's, safe for you to probably do. If it's like shark infested waters, then maybe you decide not to help, even though it's a very similar type of decision. So there's lots of contextual information that leads into actually deciding to help. A few things that are helpful to get other people to help you, because, I mean, look, there are a lot of reasons that people might not help. But you can do some things if you are ever in trouble that can help lead other people to intervene in emergencies. If you get people's attention and single people out, that can have a twofold effect, that you are having them notice it and giving them some responsibility. So if you say to a specific person that you need help, that person is much less likely to think like, whoa, it's not my responsibility. They are going to be more likely to engage with you. You help people define something as an emergency by telling them it's an emergency. So if you tell people you have a specific injury, then they're going to be more likely to help you. If you tell people that a particular person is bothering you or interfering with you, then they'll be more likely to help because they know what type of an emergency it is. Finally, they need to know what to do and decide to do it. And if you give them a very specific set of instructions, like call 911, come to this address, then they might be much more likely to help because they don't have to come up with the information. They can just go ahead and do it. All right, in the next video, we're going to shift to talk about volunteerism and long-term help.